Welcome to Distribution Talk with Jason Bader, the show where we dive into the stories, struggles, and solutions from business owners and thought leaders in the wholesale distribution market. Hey friends, Jason here. In this episode, I have a special treat for those who have been around the distribution business for a long time. As many of you know, my company, the Distribution Team, was founded to continue teaching the inventory management principles of Gordon Graham. Gordon is often referred to as the Dean of Inventory Management for Distribution, largely due to the publishing of his second book, Distribution Inventory Management, for the 1990s. The concepts in this book are the foundation on which several of today's distribution replenishment systems are built. They may have changed the verbiage or tweaked the formulas a bit, but under the hood, it's pure Graham. I have an embarrassing confession to make. I've been teaching Graham methodology in speaking engagements and seminars for the past 18 years without ever speaking to Gordon himself. This interview really came about when a young man named Rusty Ortiz reached out looking for Gordon's book. Told him I didn't have any more copies to sell, and it was really long out of print. He had apparently reached out to Gordon first, but Gordon mentioned that he had sold the rights to the Distribution Team. Well, a little surprised, I asked, "Have you actually spoken to Gordon?" Well, apparently he had tracked down Gordon's personal email and asked him about the book and some of the concepts, and apparently they've been corresponding a little bit. A little sheepishly, I asked, "Would you mind sharing Gordon's contact information?" Well, he reached out and Gordon gave him permission, and the rest is history. I'm truly appreciative of you facilitating this connection, Rusty. So here is your episode. This episode of Distribution Talk is sponsored by InSQL Distribution Software. InSQL is a fully functional distribution-based software package. I only recommend software packages that were purpose-built to serve distribution, and these folks do it very well at a price point many smaller distributors can afford. Economy doesn't mean compromise. This company is on the cutting edge of distribution-friendly applications like VMI on mobile devices, mobile signature capture, mobile CRM, warehouse management software, and e-commerce development. If you're ready to step up to a fully loaded, scalable distribution package at an affordable price, look no further than InSQL Distribution Software at www.insql.com. That's INXSQL.com. All right, Gordon. Hey, welcome to Distribution Talk. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
I'm glad to do it. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And maybe it's a little longer than I probably should have waited before it, but I'm glad we're here and had an opportunity to speak. So if you wouldn't mind, could you give our audience a little history lesson? How did you get involved with distribution and where did this inventory management world start?
It certainly didn't start in college because I majored in Bachelor of Business Administration with a major in industrial management. And there was a little bit of inventory control talk there, but the professor had only worked in one place in a shoe factory. So everything we heard was about how you made shoes and inventory, the materials for shoes. And so I learned very little there, but I didn't really care because I was going to be an Air Force officer. And I intended to make that a career. After that didn't work out. So then I went to work for a company up in the north that made glass. And I was in their production and inventory control system, scheduling their production, watching the inventory, but there again, only in manufacturing. There I went to San Antonio, Texas, worked for Frederick Air Conditioning, again in the manufacturing arena, and I was involved in their inventory control there and production control. But then I was hired by a fellow to be an operations manager for a wholesale frozen food distributor. Mm-hmm. And then there was my first introduction to distribution, which we're all familiar. And unfortunately, my way of handling that had no training, so I was just pure swag. We counted the inventory once a week, and I looked at how much we sold and determined how long it would take to get more and just guessed at it, ordered more. But after the hours in that job were awful, so I went to work then for a guy in Dallas named Bob Vandermark, patriarch of the inventory management area and production control, but he'd only worked in manufacturing and had no experience in distribution. So I was hired to come up and supposedly give him some distribution help. But there again, I was not bringing any inventory control help at all. And what I learned about inventory, I learned from him and his various systems that he had. So that's how I got involved in the distribution area.
Now, did he have a consulting practice? Is that what it was primarily?
He was a pretty well-known consultant in the 1960s in the area of production control. And he'd written a lot of paperback books, and he was a pure manual system. Everything he did was manual. He expected to stay manual. He never thought computers were ever going to be of any importance. In fact, I couldn't convince him of that. And I didn't try very hard because he didn't want anybody to question his judgment. But what I learned about the inventory, I learned from his systems of whom you'd order, how much you would order. They had some little formulas.
Okay.
The only trouble with those formulas is Bob insisted they worked every time in every situation. And maybe they had in manufacturing, but over in distribution, they just didn't.
Right.
And it was troubling because as I'd go into a client trying to help them, I could see right away there were exceptions where these systems were not going to work. And he didn't brook that. So that was a problem there with working for him. But then I was hired from there to one of our clients, which was Briggs Weaver, an industrial distributor here in Dallas, Texas.
Okay.
And Briggs, I was there to help them put in a manual system, the Vandermark system. And I did. And then they wanted to convert that to a computer. And so for the first time, I went through that process of let's take all this stuff and put it on a computer, all the formulas. But it took about 3 or 4 years. But now I'm thoroughly into distribution now. And only distribution.
So if you were to look at both sides, you spent both sides there. You spent a lot of time on the manufacturing side early on in the career, and then you moved to distribution. What did you find was completely different? I mean, what was the real difference between distribution and manufacturing? Because I see a lot of software packages today that they were built for manufacturing, and then they try to play distribution, but they just don't play very well. How do you see the differences in between these two areas?
Jason, the biggest difference was the manufacturing systems didn't have to deal with line buying, where you couldn't just order one item at a time. Manufacturers generally can. They order they may have 4 or 5 different items coming from from their source, but they can order just one item. They don't have to put a line together. Distributors couldn't do that. And when they went to order Black & Decker tools, they had to have a certain amount to put together to make an order large enough to pay the freight or whatever discount they were trying to reach. And those manufacturing systems just didn't handle that at all. And so that was the biggest difference. And that was the one thing. Vandermark system didn't handle it either. Yeah. So one of the things that I developed was the way to handle the line buying problem.
Absolutely. No, definitely. That's, it's interesting you say that. And as I said, a lot of the software companies that I run into today that really were built to be manufacturing software packages, they just have a tough time playing distribution. I mean, if I look at their replenishment systems, they tend to be very rudimentary, maybe give you an option of a min max. I mean, just really pretty lightweight stuff. And then they sell it for more money than the distribution software packages are. And that's just, it's frustrating to me. And I know I'm probably going to upset a couple people that are listening to the show, but I guess I have to call it like it is. I don't like it.
That's true. And that was the problem back in the 70s. There were some manufacturing software systems that were available, and distributors sometimes would buy those and then try to modify them.
Yeah.
And that was a can of worms. It was very difficult because if you got it, we did that at one point. I worked for a company called Coastal Plains. It was a bearings and power transmission distributor. And we made the mistake of buying a system and then modifying it to our needs. Before we were through, we spent far more money on it to try to modify it than we would have had just developed a system from scratch on our own. Yeah. So eventually, some of the software, when my books came out in the 80s, that was the first time anybody had given them a system to work with. There had been individual little articles in various trade journals and magazines and newsletters. A guy named Dickie Dyer, another guy named Alan Silver, had written these little bits and pieces, but there was no system. There was nobody that tried to put it all together. So that was one of the reasons I wrote the book, is I'd had the same learning curve twice in Briggs Weaver and at Coastal Plains and putting a system in. And I thought, surely there's a way that I can write this down and people can benefit from these, not have to go through the same trial and error that we did. And it did. The first book, however, was published by a company in New York that would only knew manufacturing. They didn't know how to advertise it.
Gotcha.
So it didn't sell very well, but it did give me some national recognition. And then later I wrote another book that I knew how to sell, and that did give me much, much better sales volume. But
Yes.
the point was, now they had a book that showed them how to do this, the line buying problem, all these other things. And some of these software companies begin to program them that way. And now there was a distribution option rather than the pure manufacturing option that had to be changed. And that helped a lot. And during my career, after a while, I would be hired by these software companies to help them get that system working. Then I could recommend it. And after a little while, if it didn't have that endorsement, it was hard to sell it. And so the software companies were sort of put in a tough spot. If it didn't do it the way Graham said to do it, then they were having a hard time selling the system, so they needed to be endorsed. And IBM and others, the hardware guys got involved. They would hire me to put on a training session somewhere or a workshop with the theory that the people would say, well, now IBM doesn't have software, but they've got good hardware that runs the Graham software. And they'll have various different ones there at these workshops. And they would be able to at least find somebody that could run the software the way we're talking about it. But of course, that made a lot of enemies too, because internationally, the software companies that didn't carry my endorsement they got mad.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. If they weren't on I believe it was the white hat list, then they were in trouble there.
They actually thought that you bought your way onto that list, but that was not the case at all. The only way you got on the list was just do it the way I'd ask you to do it. And if you did, if you programmed it according to what I'd say to do, fine. And I would help them tweak it a little bit, make it do a better job. And then if that was the case, fine. One outfit flew a couple of guys down to Dallas and took me to lunch, and they thought that was all it took. Just take Graham to lunch and boy, you'll be on the list. Of course, I explained to them, no, it's not how it worked. Right. And boy, they were furious. And they were big advertisers in the trade journals. So when they got back home, they put an economic blackmail on me. They called those trade journals and said, if you run any more Gordon Graham articles, we're not going to advertise in your trade journal. So, boy, of course, I could have sued them over that, but that was silly. You didn't need to do that. But that was how desperate they would get sometimes.
I don't know about you, but maybe back then you got paid for trade journal articles, but I sure don't, man. It doesn't work that way today. I'm like, all right, you want to blackball me? All right, I'll take my articles somewhere else. I have no problem with that whatsoever.
Yeah, that was pretty much what I had to do.
Yeah.
Was say, well, I'm sorry, if you don't run the article, I'll maybe write for somebody else that will.
Yep, absolutely. And there are plenty of trade journals out there. I think just a quick tangent. I found that to be one of the more interesting things when I left my family business and came over and started teaching and consulting. I was shocked how easy it is to actually get an article published. I mean, look, a guy like me, are you kidding me? I actually got published in magazines, and it was really actually my college friends thought that was quite humorous as well, that I was getting published. But a lot of people don't understand that these trade journals are dying for content, starving for it. And really, if you can put a couple sentences together and with a reasonable argument, you should go out and approach them.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
It was the same way initially with book publishers at first. Now, this is in the 80s. Some of them would publish 40 books a year, knowing that they were not all going to sell. And they would put as the ones that began to sell a little bit, then they'd put their advertising in that arena, and the others would just kind of die. They sort of knew that was going to happen. But you could get a book published pretty easy. Now, that's probably not the case today, but it was then. The same thing about the trade journals. The electrical industry, the plumbing, heating, and piping, industrial, They all had their journals, and they needed something to say. And in my case, it was a new voice coming along, answering some questions that no one had ever tried to answer other than little bits and pieces of it. Mm-hmm. So it worked pretty well. Now, it was just a good timing. I just happened to come along at just the right time in a little narrow niche of business that needed that kind of help. The stuff I was saying was not very remarkable. It wasn't rocket science at all. It was very simplistic, but it did make sense, and they could understand it. And of course, that was one of the reasons I never did care much for the real high math approaches to inventory control is because not that they don't get good answers, it's just that the people using the system generally will not understand how that computer got that answer. And if they can't duplicate it, they'll get in trouble using it someday. And then the boss will jump them. And from that point forward, they'll use their own swag, scientific, wild-ass guessing.
You bet. Oh, absolutely. And Gordon, what's so interesting is, we're 30 years later here and 30 plus years later, and I still see the same things. I see people confused by what the software has decided to put in there. And I think sometimes it's this overcomplication of software. Everybody thinks they want to have their own special formula. They want to just put a tweak on it so that they can say, well, we have the magic pixie dust. And it makes me very angry that they feel like they have to do this to sell their software. It's like, let's make it easy on the people who are trying to use it. That's really where it comes down to. And I get very disappointed when I see people really try to overcomplicate some of these systems.
Good point. And it makes it difficult for the software developer too, because if you put a system out there and then you start to change it customer by customer, and then you need to put some kind of an upgrade to it out, it's very difficult to make that upgrade fit all these changes you've made.
That's right.
You really need to have a really good, solid system to start, and then make very few changes. Or if you do it in such a fashion that an upgrade doesn't affect it. Whoever, you can separately deal with whatever change you've made for that client, and it doesn't affect your ability to change the whole system. Because that was a really tough problem, and each customer would have his own little unique thing he wanted in the system. He wanted the reports to be this way. Well, you can make the report appear any way you wanted to if you had the database.
Yeah.
But some of the other things you couldn't, and they'd want to do it the old way, the way they'd always been doing it for 30 years. And you're saying, well, this is really just a better way of doing it, or a different way, but it's not. Oh, we're going to do it that way. Yeah. Well, you're not really going to benefit from the system if you do that.
Right.
And that was hard to sell, especially in the old days when you were trying to get people to change from a Cardex to a computer. They were scared to death of it. And you can imagine why, because they kept thinking, well, if I can't use this, they're not going to need me here and I'll get fired. So I just want to keep doing it the way I've always done it, because I know I'm valuable that way. But if I try to use the system and I can't use it, boy, I'm gone. So they'd fight you. Don't want to change.
Oh, yeah. And, it's interesting. I still see that today when people are buying new software packages and they want to, throw in all these modifications to make it feel and look like the old package they were working on. And I try to remind them, number one, the more you modify, the more difficult it's going to be to upgrade. And two, the more you modify, the more expensive it's going to get. You have a very limited amount of people that actually understand that modification. And then three, maybe the way that the software was built is a better way to do things. And maybe we should consider doing this. And I think I try to remind people that you have a couple hundred to a couple thousand users of this software that are contributing good distribution ideas to the development of this package. How come you think you're so smart? Why do you think you're smarter than all 2,000 of those other people that have been contributing to this?
Boy, that is an excellent point, and a difficult point to make, but an excellent point, because that's what you're saying is these other 500,000 users don't know what they're doing, and you do.
And you've
got the answer, and they don't. They're all using this system, and they're making it work, and they're making money from it. And somehow you can't do that because you've got a unique problem. No, you really don't. Your problem is no different. Yeah, but we're a paper distributor, and they're industrial. Well, yeah, but and there will be some differences, true, but not major differences in how you do it. So it's very hard to get them to go along with you and try the new idea, the new way of doing it. Now, once they try it, generally they'll say, well, gosh, this is good. We should have done that. Yeah. But remember now, there's 4 stages you go through with in each kind of a new system. And, the one, remember, it's the oh boy stage. Wow, this is really going to be great.
Yeah.
Then they get into it and they go, it's the S word,
Yeah.
Because now I don't want to have to do what it's saying, and I don't like it, and I may fail. And finally, you have to go. The third stage is, well, they're going to make me do it. I guess I better. Oh, okay. And then finally, hey, it's great. We love it. But you don't go from stage 1 to stage 4 without going through those other two. And
Very
that's
true.
true in almost any changeover of any kind of a system.
And you know, it's so interesting. I've seen a lot of people recently kind of get lured into some of these packages that are the jack of all trades packages, the ones that could be programmed to really any business out there, you know, and I don't love to put their names out there, but they are very what we call open source, you know, types of packages. You know, people love the flexibility. So they get excited about flexibility. You can do this and this, and we can program this. And I try to remind them that when you get into a package like that, you're the one who has to do the programming. It's going to be your best ideas, nobody else's, because the rest of the user base, they're not distributors. They don't do what you do for a living. I try to steer people to distribution based packages as much as humanly possible. But boy, every once in a while, I just get vetoed, and somebody will say, "Oh, we really like this open thing." It's giant, and it's generally the IT person who all of a sudden looks at it and says, "I've got this brand new open palette that I can do anything I want with." And then the president of the company has no idea how much money they're about to, you know, how big a check they're about to write over the next few years.
Yeah, I don't know what the cost would be today, but in the old days, back in the 70s and 80s, they would spend maybe $100,000 for a system, but they'd spend $500,000 then making it work properly.
Right.
And then finally get frustrated because it really wasn't doing what they were doing, but they were so deep in the money to it, they kept fooling with it, messing with it. Finally, they had just this conglomeration of system that didn't really help them at all, but it was unique to their company, but it sure was. But then the original developers would bring an upgrade. They couldn't use that upgrade at all because they'd made too many changes to the program.
Right. They developed those Frankensteins, and then there's just nothing you can do at that point. And then if somebody decides to come and offer to buy your business, now we're in real trouble because there's just nothing that they can be compatible with.
Well, in distribution, of course, there's a wide range of distributors. A food distributor would have different problems than a hardware distributor because you're going to have the shelf life problem. And I had to admit that a lot of stuff, my stuff didn't work everywhere. And one of the things I had to be real careful was not trying to force it into where it didn't go. Once in a while, I'd be asked to come talk to a group, and I would tell them right up front, I don't think my stuff works for your people. You've got some unique situations here that a good example with the steel service center business.
Okay, yeah.
They had some very unique problems there, and they could make it work, and they did, but it was difficult for them. And I had to be careful not to tread into that area because it just didn't work. There's such a wide variety of distributor types and industries. But there's about 4 or 5 real basic ones. You know, there's industrial, electrical, plumbing, heating, cooling, piping.
Yep.
And then many bearings and power transmission, and a lot of the offshoots of those that are all in one unique group. And they all have the same kind of problem. But now if you're going to move over into paper distribution and some of these others, it gets to be a little bit different.
Sure. I think that, Gordon, what I found over the years of working with your material and teaching is that perishability was one of my litmus tests for sure. And volatility of price, of cost. That was also one of those where I'd always kind of say, I don't know if this is a great place for me to play here.
And seasonal business too, Jason.
Seasonal, yeah, absolutely.
A very seasonal business is a difficult one to handle because it's got some very strange problems there. Is this season going to be like last season? A good
Probably not.
Now, how could you use 2020's history in almost any business to project what's going to happen in 2021? It's really tough because it's such a different situation now.
Yeah, absolutely, Gordon. I think, that's why I did steer clear of a lot of vertical markets, just because I felt like this is really not my best place to play. Grocery, and the perishability there. Pharmaceutical, I stayed away from all of that. I didn't want anything to do with that. The one, though, I did say yes to, which was kind of funny, was the nursery and landscape business. I said, well, it was so funny. They reached out and they said, would you come speak at this? I said, I don't know. I don't know if this is really the right fit, but, okay, I'll come down and I'll talk, and let's just see where it goes. And I think what was fascinating, and actually to this day, I've done quite a bit in the nursery and landscape business. I didn't know how they would apply what I was saying They are the ones who figured out what to do. And
Yeah.
they really loved, hits, and they loved understanding transactions. And I'm going to put my highest hit products up near the front of the yard, closest to the customers. I thought, okay, you guys win. You know what you're doing better than I do. And I think sometimes that was one that really surprised me. I thought, okay, because, let's face it, that's a perishable business. When their products die, they turn brown and they roll over. That's a very perishable business. And so it was a unique one for me.
Yeah, you can learn from them too. And sometimes you'd go into an outfit that was a little different, and they had some way they handled a particular problem that was new to you. And you could, hey, that's a good idea. I'm going to try to use that from here on with other people like you. Your example there, the landscaping business would be good.
That was a really interesting one. And then I think another interesting business that I started to spend a lot of time in, and I'm still doing a little work in, is the beauty supply business. Again, it's not necessarily perishability of product, but it's preferences. So somebody goes on a TV show and all of a sudden the nail polish color changes and that's the hot color. And all of a sudden you've got to switch really quickly to, I don't have the right colors on the shelf here. I got to move. So that was always a fun one.
Yeah, if you're in a business where it's fashion driven some way, oh boy, last year's color may not be this year's color at all.
It's exactly what happens. And it was really funny. I was down in California with a beauty supply distributor, and they had a whole shelf of different nail polish colors. And all of a sudden he said, we got to switch. And it's one of those things that, again, it's that fashion based, or what I would say emotionally based changes in that market they're tough to deal with. I mean, but I think that, again, being a teacher and really wanting to help, you're going to find something to help that company. And I think that's really what's served me pretty well over the last several years. That was the driver, is I'm going to find a way to help them. Even if it's not the way that I've helped others, I'm going to find another way to help them and move forward. So,
it's interesting. There were situations that I would be called in to try to help them with inventory control where the problem was not inventory at all. It was something entirely different. An example of that, these two brothers that owned the company called me one time to come up, and they just couldn't get along. They ran the company together. Papa had given it to them, but they hated each other. And one of them would leave town to go on a trip. The other guy would move all his furniture out of his office into the hallway or something. It was just terrible. And the employees didn't know who was going to win that battle, so they were always walking the fence. They didn't know whose order to follow, because one guy would tell them to do A, another guy would tell them to do B, and they didn't know what to do. So my counsel to them, which made them extremely angry, was, gentlemen, I can't help you with inventory control until you fix that problem right there. Right. One of you has got to sell out to the other one or let the other guy be president. And until you do that, there's nothing going to work here. Oh, well, we didn't call you up here to tell us that. Well, I'm sorry, but that's your answer.
That's the answer. Yes.
Boy, they paid me and I went home, but I don't know what they ever did.
Oh, Gordon, I've run into a couple of those over the years, and you wonder if that check's going to cash. You just don't know if it's going to cash when they send it to you. And it is interesting though. And you definitely see the good, bad, and the ugly as you move through this. You just see all kinds of different.
That's some interesting situations come up too while I was up speaking. You never know what's going to happen when you're up talking to an audience.
Oh yeah.
One time I was up in front of one, and it was a private session, and there were about 100 guys there, but all from the same company. And this young lady came walking down the side of the aisle, and she was dressed really pretty. It was summertime. She had a little flowery dress on, little hat, came up to her and just interrupted me and said, "Is Mr. Jones here?" And I said, "Oh, gosh, this must be important." I said, "Well, is Mr. Jones?" And well, he was sitting on the front row. He was the president of the company. And she goes over and stands right in front of him and says, "You know who I am?" And he says, "No, I don't." Takes off the hat. "Now?" "No." Takes off the dress down to a bikini. She's gorgeous. And he says, "No." She said, "Well, you did last night." And then she sings happy birthday and sits on his lap. And people in the audience had put him up for that. See, they'd hired her. And when she tried to do it, the guys in the back tried to stop her, but she wasn't going to be stopped. She came up in front and was going to do her thing. Well, you can just imagine that audience is gone for about 5 minutes. You might as well quit talking to them, take a break or something.
Take your break. Yeah, that's break time.
Listen to you anymore.
I cannot say I have run into that, but that's a big yet. maybe someday that'll happen to me, but
Well,
oh yeah.
the worst one that ever happened to me was I was up in Boston, and this was way back, and I was following a guy on the program that had been a prisoner of war in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's up in front in his Navy uniform giving this very emotional, patriotic speech about what America meant to him. And when he finished, the audience is on its feet cheering, and there's a band in back playing the Stars and Stripes Forever as the guy walks down the aisle with an honor guard leaving the auditorium. And I'm next up on the program to talk about inventory control. So I should have checked that. I should have got where I was on the program, because that was a mistake. So I just got up there and said, well, nothing I've got to say is important as what he said.
Right.
Let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll get back. Well, the audience was gone anyway. Emotionally, they were whipped. When they came back, then I could say, we'll never do anything as important as that, but we've got jobs to do to help our people that work for us and work in our companies, and we've got to do the best we can. So we kind of went on from there, and it worked okay. But I just learned something. Always check where you are on the program. Oh, boy.
I know. Don't you know it? I have found myself getting slotted into the 4 o'clock slot, the dreaded, 4 p.m. slot. And it's just like, well, why bother? It's just like, well, I'll do what I can here, but the association exec or whoever put the meeting planner said, well, we just got to cram one more in. And I'm like, well, all right. That one and the 1 o'clock slot are horrible.
The best time is right the first one in the morning. If you can be the first guy up in the morning, that's the best one.
I teach at the UID, University of Innovative Distribution, and I always request first out of the chute. I want first slot, because unfortunately that last slot a couple days in, that's a pretty sparse crowd right there. So,
well, you have to remember that some of these people that if you're in a town where they've traveled to be there, these guys don't get out of town very often. If you're the first guy up the second day, well, they've been out on the town partying all night long, because they never get to do that. And boy, some of them are in bad shape the next morning when you're trying to get their attention.
So I was teaching one of the inventory management seminars, and I decided to hold it in Las Vegas. Okay, that is a mistake. That is definitely a mistake. I do not want to do that again. And I recall I had one of those gentlemen who had been out late. He might not have gone to bed. I'm not sure, but I don't think he went to bed. But he came in, and he was there when we started at 8:30, and he looked at me for about a half an hour. And then slowly his head started to go down and just went to sleep right there on the desk. And he just laid there, and we looked at him and said, well, let's just let him sleep. And we just kind of went on with our class. But funniest thing I've ever run into.
Those are fun experiences.
They are. And I think that really, it does make it all rewarding. And so one of the things I was going to ask you was, you had worked for these companies and in inventory control, and then you made a decision to teach, to leave that world and hang your shingle out and teach. Why did you do that?
Actually, I just left it pretty much entirely. I did start doing some work and teaching in scriptural things, Bible studies. But I had, frankly, Jason, after 20 years of travel on airplanes and cabs and all kinds of weather and situations where sometimes you get there and they washed out the roads, and you still have to be somewhere. You get there at 2 or 3 in the morning, but you got to be there. I decided that if I could find somebody that would continue the ideas, and I could sell these concepts, because a man named Ollie White had done that in manufacturing years ago, and his company may even still be going. But I know for many years after he retired, this Ollie White people were continuing to propagate his ideas. And I thought maybe I could do the same thing. So I put out some feelers. And as you know, I talked to a software company that had used our system, my concepts, and were pretty heavily invested in it. I thought maybe they would be good to maybe buy it. But it wasn't good for them, because then, of course, people would have said, well, naturally, Graham, they're Graham endorsed because they are Graham. They bought the Graham company.
They bought the guy.
Somebody else. A fellow named Scott Stratman, was one of their employees, and he bought the company from me. And I was, at that time, glad to turn it over to him. He did allow me to work a little bit for another 4 or 5 years. That's kind of a part-time situation. But after that, I decided I just needed to quit, and I was glad to quit.
Yeah.
That was about 2000. So I've been 20 years retired fully.
Yeah.
I spent that time I've written a commentary on the book of Isaiah and
Hmm.
some other things that I thought were very important. Maybe as you get along later in life, you realize how important it is, that they're far more important than what you were talking about before. Because I'm almost 87 now. Gosh, it won't be long. I'll be going to my reward. It's important to know where that's going to be.
Yeah.
And of course, all through my career, my faith in Jesus Christ was what helped me so much. There were many, many situations that only worked out because Christ was guiding my steps and helping me every step of the way.
Well, and you had dedicated, in the books, the dedication was too, and you know it better than I do. But, I think that that's interesting. And a lot of folks might have a difficulty talking about that or sharing that. But I mean, it was a huge part, of who you are and how you approached your, not only your practice, but really your life in general.
Absolutely. I think you need to be sure people know exactly what you stand for
Hmm.
and that you are a person of integrity and that they can count on what you're saying as not being some kind of scam.
Yeah.
That uh, you're trustworthy. Those were important things to me, and I think that was part of why the stuff that I said was kind of successful because it was first of all simple, but
Yeah.
it was also I'd had some experience in the field. They knew that I was coming. I was just talking about how it was when I was there and how the kind of people I had dealt with that they were
Hmm.
dealing with every day. And
Yeah.
then, of course, that it's so important to realize that if you don't have any faith in your life and you're trying to handle every problem on your own,
Hmm.
and nobody can handle every problem on your own. No one, none of us can do that. You've got to have someone in your life larger than you who you trust and you have faith in, and you know that when
Hmm.
you die, you're going to be in that in Christ's presence.
Hmm.
And if you don't have that, life is a drudge. It's tough.
It is. And I think that, I'm glad you pointed out integrity because that's one of the big things that over the years that I've been teaching, not only, that inventory management seminar, but I'm teaching branch management seminars as well. And I teach manufacturers reps as well, how to sell into distribution. So a lot of different things. But one of the things I do leave on every single time is talking about integrity and really developing your core values and then eventually starting to trust those core values, but then being able to share that as well. And if you really are not willing to live your life with integrity and share that with other people, it's going to be tough. It's going to be a tough road. And really, I think for these young managers and these really anybody, young practitioners and young people in their career, they're going to struggle with this, and it's going to be a struggle. And I think that again, finding something greater than myself is extremely important, not only in my professional career but in my life as well.
There were times in my career when that kind of thing came up and hit me head on. There was one time when a head of a distributor association asked me to do something that was illegal, but it would have benefited him and his association.
Hmm.
And I just told him I couldn't do that. He said, "Well, if you don't, I'll never use you again." I said, "Well, I guess you'll never use me again because I cannot do that.
Right.
Not only illegal, it's immoral and it's wrong, and I'm not going to do it."
Yeah.
And, and he lived up to his word. He never did use me again in any of his things. But then later on, he got fired for something else, I'm sure.
Yep.
So, you just have to, like you say, if you don't have integrity, first of all, who do you like doing business with? When you're working with someone and you can trust them and you know that what they say, their word is their bond, then you feel comfortable working with those. How do you feel when you're working with somebody that you can't trust, that doesn't have integrity?
Yeah.
We both had experiences like that, and
Yep.
it's if you get involved in that with a business relationship, you almost need to get away from it, break it if you can, because it'll drag you down.
It will. And it's interesting you mentioned, I recall a manufacturer that, I had a good relationship again when I was on the distribution side, when I was still with the family business. And I remember he said something very specific to me. He said, I only do business with people I know, like, and trust. And I remember there was another distributor that was really prone to beating up manufacturers. He loved, it was sport to him. And he would make fun of this guy because this guy was he would speak in kind of an old-fashioned tone, more golly gee and shucks, and and he was very would consider Pollyanna in speech. But I recall one time where this distributor was giving this guy a bad time, and the guy looked at him and said, "I only do business with people I know, like, and trust, and you're not one of them." And then that was it. Just walked away, and I always respected that because I knew what that guy stood for. And to this day, I think, he's probably one of the best examples I've ever seen of that, who really stood his ground, said, and this account could have been a very large multi-million-dollar account. And he said, "I'm just not interested in that." And that's the kind of guy, and I think that's definitely what I would see. That's the integrity right there. That is the model of integrity right there.
When the old dollar's on the line, that's when the love of money is the root of all evil. Not money itself. Money's a tool.
Right.
But the love of it has created all kinds of evil.
It sure has. It sure has.
When sometimes you're faced with having to give it up or stand your ground, it's hard to stand your ground.
Yeah.
But you have to if you're going to have a life of integrity.
I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely. Well, Gordon, I truly appreciate this time. I'm so glad that you took the time to speak with me and to share some thoughts, with the audience. I know that some of the folks who, that I've been around, I've been teaching, and they'll ask about you, and they'll ask, "How are you?" And, my friend, you've got fans out there still. You got a bunch of fans out there now. They're getting close to retirement, but we got them still. They're still in the fold and they're still listening. So
most of them are in retirement centers now. They're in nursing homes.
But I told you, the guy who brought us together, he's a young guy. So the stuff, it absolutely carries on. And I've enjoyed my career, working with your material. And so I do appreciate that immensely. I mean, it was something that I could absolutely grab onto and believe in and say, this is going to help distributors. And that's what I wanted to do. That's the reason I left the family business to go teach, was I want to help these family businesses. I want to see them succeed.
That makes me feel good, Jason. Yeah. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time, and I look forward to the next time we speak. Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, consider hitting that subscribe button. Links to sponsors, products, and services mentioned during this episode can be found in the show description area on your podcast application or at www.distributiontalk.com. Distribution Talk is edited and mixed by Andrea Klunder and Edwin Ruiz of the Creative Imposter Studios. This episode was brought to you by Connected Peers Organization. CPO is a new organization dedicated to providing fast-paced monthly networking opportunities for industry peers. To learn more about how CPO can bring solutions to your role, visit us on the web at www.connectedpeers.com.